It's the week ending Saturday, the 23rd of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Rishi Sunak pushing back the ban of sales on new petrol and diesel cars to 2035, Russell Brand being dropped by his publisher, agent, and YouTube monetization after a documentary aired alleging sexual assault allegations against him, and King Charles becoming the first British monarch to address the French Senate. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from Money Week, we have Mr. Guy Anker from Daily History Podcast, Today in History with the Retrospectors. It's Arion McNicoll. And our favourite millennial in Gen Z clothing, it's Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Arion, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learned that black gold has recently become even blacker.
The Diamond 8 sets off down Taiwan's coast. It passes a port on April 30th, where a second, much larger red tanker is loading up oil. That tanker, called Superstar at the time, follows the Diamond 8 to international waters, according to the ship's transmissions. Cloudy skies that day appear to shield the operation from satellites. But, as we saw, a hole in the clouds reveals the oil transfer.
How a mysterious ship helps North Korea evade oil sanctions. A video from the New York Times from 2021. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Arion, what's the story?
So this week, following on the heels of that New York Times investigation, The Guardian did an excellent long read about the growing fleet of so-called shadow tankers, which is the term that's come to describe the hundreds of ships that are transporting sanctioned oil, completely disregarding all industry regulations and insurance and international law, and crucially, getting around sanctions. And sanctions, of course, are one of the most powerful ways that countries can try to punish each other without actually going to war on them. But this creates an obvious incentive for both countries and corporations to find ways around these sanctions, which is why there are so many of these shadow tankers, also known as ghost tankers, by the way, which are now roaming the seas delivering oil by finding these loopholes in the way that sanctions are constructed, or simply by violating them altogether.
Well, regardless of whether they're called shadow tankers or ghost tankers, it all sounds like something out of a Ben Elton novel. But this is actually quite a big issue, isn't it? What countries are they delivering to?
They're delivering all over the place, actually, but the oil that they're taking is sort of the most significant aspect. They're taking oil from countries that we know to have sanctions against them, places like Iran, and like Russia, and delivering them then often to regimes that are friendly to those places, but also through very complex means, they are managing to sometimes pull alongside other oil tankers, dump their oil off into those tankers, and then pretending that it's come from a different source altogether, and then they can deliver it wherever they want.
So sort of ship-to-ship transfer at sea. So, Chandrika, how else do these tanks go undetected?
They're using all different ways as kind of going undercover. So in terms of having a paper trail or a digital trail, they're hidden behind shell companies. And these vessels are often characterized by they change of flag, which feels very piratey. They have changes of owners. And crucially, they often operate without insurance. You can't even track them back to the insurers and see where they started out from and who sort of okayed that vessel taking the oil. So when the ships are abandoned beyond repair, because again, they're not looked after to kind of international standards, the insurer becomes the owner and takes responsibility for the scrapping. And without the listed insurer, again, it's really hard to actually find out who owns it, who's been taking it around, and who at the end of the day has responsibility for breaking international sanctions.
And that lack of insurer, though, Guy, I mean, it might be hard to trace who owns it, but it's not that hard, obviously, to trace that these tankers exist because journalists have been able to do it now for 2 publications. So why is no one policing this?
Well, it's a good question, and you know, obviously, other ways of tracing it through satellite imagery and what have you. But why is no one policing this? I mean, funnily enough, when Arion suggested the story, I remember having a look at it myself. I'd never heard of this issue myself. Now, of course, I'm not the international police force in policing shadow oil tankers.
For those of us under any illusion.
But I suspect it's not the number one thing on the world's list of priorities right now. But really interesting point around the lack of insurance, and also the fact that a lot of these vessels are simply not complying with regulations. A lot of them are old. And there's a story which the Guardian reported on of a really serious explosion on one, and it potentially creates one heck of a hazard, because if they're transporting oil, we've seen many occasions, haven't we, over the past few decades, of horrendous oil spills and what it does for the environment. So quite apart from the fact that they're breaking international law, they're supporting regimes that are doing bad things, they are also clearly a threat to the environment and, of course, to the people working on them. And I suspect a lot of people working them aren't the decision makers, are they? Their lives are at risk as well.
Is it the case then, Arion, that you want to bring this to our attention because you think actually it should be more of a priority for international law enforcement? Because the point is, the West basically has sanctioned a lot of countries, and this is circumnavigating that. It's making those efforts, is it making those efforts slightly useless?
Yes, definitely. That's exactly what it does. And in fact, it's a big story that I thought was worthy of all our attention because of the sheer scale of it, among other reasons. The shadow tanker fleet is now thought to number more than 600 ships, which is roughly a fifth of the overall global crude oil tanker fleet. So this is big business. But the case that the Guardian pinpointed of the ship that Guy was talking about there, the Pablo, the tanker in question was a really old tanker. It probably shouldn't have been at sea in the first place, but it's been extended past its natural life because there is this opportunity for trade. And, if there wasn't this illicit purpose, it probably would have been retired long ago. But, it is out there sailing the seas in this dangerous way that presents, again, as Guy said, a danger to its crew, but also to the world around it. It exploded having just dumped off its cargo in China, but had it exploded when it was full, you could imagine that the results would have been really much more catastrophic. As it turned out, the area of Batam in Indonesia was left to clean tons of oil waste from their beaches that would ordinarily be thronged with tourists. But had it been full at the time it had exploded, it would have been an even more serious environmental catastrophe.
And this lack of insurance that you mentioned, Suchandrika, means that if a ship does catch fire or there is an environmental catastrophe, no one is obliged to go and sort it out, right?
No, exactly. So give me 1 second. So ironically, there is a shipping review from the insurer Allianz. So insurers are picking up on this problem. The reporting has made its way to the people who kind of should be in charge and should be asked to look after these ships. But they had a safety and shipping review this year, and they've noticed the growing list of sanctions against Russia mean that these more than 600 tankers are likely to be older ships with lower maintenance and likely to have problems at sea. There were at least 8 groundings, collisions, or near misses involving these tankers carrying sanctioned oil products in 2022. So that comes from Allianz. So what Arion was saying is obviously there could be environmental dangers, there's dangers to life, but also it kind of makes a mockery of the countries that have sanctioned the nations where this oil is coming from, because this does originate with Donald Trump in 2018. He brings the US out of the Obama era deal with Iran. And the response is kind of like, well, actually, there's a black market for oils. Whatever that guy says doesn't really matter.
Is oil just too important? Like no nation, North Korea, Russia, whoever, is not going to try and find a way to keep oil coming in or going out in the case of Russia.
But there's also an argument. Do you actually engage with these ships? In the same way that, certain drugs are legal now. They weren't legal 30, 40 years ago, legal in certain countries anyway. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but point being, if you do nothing, then this just goes on. You have unsafe ships. You potentially create one heck of a hazard for the local environment, wherever that is, danger for the crew involved as well. Do you then engage with them? I haven't answered your question directly, but sort of related to that, I don't have the answer to that question, but I think it's a question that's worth posing.
Yeah, and I think that is an important question about whether sanctions themselves create this market. And, the whole business of sanctions is frequently up for broad reflection and review, and often has changed direction. In the 80s and 90s, it used to be the norm for countries like the US to target entire countries, which raised these obvious humanitarian concerns, which were then addressed by those countries who were doing the sanctioning slightly changing direction and trying to do more targeted sanctions, such as freezing assets and travel bans and those sorts of things that would minimize the harm to ordinary people, but hopefully be able to strangle the funding to, for example, terrorist groups. But that's started to change back. You do now have this trend back towards the broader punishment of nations, not least through secondary sanctions, which look to target not just the nation in question, but anyone who does dealing with them, any sort of business with them at all. And that's why, there is this imperative that's quite complicated for all of those insurers, often based in the West, that still, are the most legitimate places that oil transporting companies can go to for the guarantees that they need. But that binds those companies up in the complexity of the moral question of whether they want to get involved in something that is fundamentally shady. And often, I guess, they want to turn a blind eye to even the question of it so they don't have to think about it too hard. But, there really are these questions about whether sanctions themselves are an effective tool that, I think a story like this does make us want to revisit, if not necessarily overhaul entirely.
Yeah. Okay. Suchandrika, you're up next after this. Okay, Suchandrika, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Can you go to prison for just holding up a sign?
I'm here today because I've been watching some of the Insulate Britain trials at the Inner London Crown Court. And I've been very concerned that the judge, I feel, is kind of almost instructing the jurors that they must follow his legal directions.
Trudy Warner, a retired social worker from London, speaking to the environmental campaign group Insulate Britain back in March outside the Old Bailey. Suchandrika, who are they? Who is she? And what's happened this week?
So Insulate Britain are a kind of activist group looking to get us to insulate our homes properly in the UK and therefore help with the use of energy in our homes and general climate change. So Trudy Warner is a retired social worker. I guess she's now a climate change activist. So basically, she is 68. She could face 2 years in prison or a fine for holding up a sign for jurors just to read as they go into the court back in March when Insulate Britain members were on trial. So now the Attorney General, that's the news this week, they've confirmed that the pensioner and former social worker will be prosecuted for contempt of court. Now, Warner did not interact with the jurors entering the court, but her sign, which was holding up like a kind of sandwich board, said, "Jurors, you have an absolute right to acquit a defendant according to your conscience." She was also challenging judge-imposed restrictions on the Insulate Britain defendants in the trial. Now, this prevented them from mentioning climate change or property insulation in their defence. So that makes you wonder what kind of defence they can actually put up. And as Warner faces a possible jail sentence, there's a separate investigation going on into allegations of attempting to pervert the course of justice relating to at least 12 other people who've copied her form of protest and also stood outside in the London Crown Court in May holding similar placards.
Okay, so let's talk about the placards then, because, she was talking then in that clip we just played, wasn't she, about her objections about how the judge was directing the jury, in her view, away from using protests against climate change as a defence. But the words, what were they again that were on her sandwich board?
Jurors, you have an absolute right to acquit a defendant according to your conscience.
Now, that is just a fact, isn't it?
It's taken from an engraving inside the Old Bailey. It's kind of like we do not have a constitution, but this is one of the kind of underpinnings of our legal system, that we have juries. They have a right to make their own minds up.
Arion, what's the history of that phrase?
Yeah, so it comes from the Bushell case of 1670, which refers to the legal case of, you won't be surprised to hear this, Edward Bushell. He was one of the jurors in the trial of 2 Quakers who were charged with unlawful assembly for preaching about their religious beliefs in public. And during the trial, the judge, Sir Samuel Starling, instructed the jury that basically they had to find the men guilty regardless of the evidence that they were about to be presented with and regardless of the law. And Edward Bushell and his other jurors at first found these men guilty, as they were all instructed to do. However, when the jurors were brought back to give the court their verdict, Bushell actually challenged the judge's authority to do exactly what he tried to do, which he said was this sort of offering of an unjust instruction that, shouldn't be allowed in a case like this, and jurors should have the opportunity to have this impartiality. But I think the reason why it's complicated in this particular case is that, as I understand it, what's being celebrated, because that particular quote that Trudy Warner had on her placard is also in the Old Bailey itself. It's actually affixed to the wall. And so you'd think it would be fairly uncontroversial. But I think what the judge
it's like in God we trust, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's sort of got this this meaning that is attempting to be, that the court wants to communicate to jurors, which is that they're allowed to make their own mind up. But what they're also not allowed to do is just ignore all evidence that is presented towards them. You're meant to sort of apply your reasoning, not your prejudices. And I suppose where this case gets complicated is that the judge was trying to crack down on the idea that jurors might be sympathetic, as I personally am, to the fact that these people were protesting in defense of the climate and the environment. And I think that, that there was a concern in the judge's mind that if people knew too much about what their cause was, then they wouldn't judge the case on its facts. And so that's where it all gets quite thorny, and I think, actually quite a complicated story.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of understand intellectually why you'd say it gets thorny, but actually from the judge's point of view, it isn't, is it, Guy? I mean, it is actually, he's there to make sure that the trial is whether or not these people have broken the laws. And that is actually regardless of what their motive might have been to be out protesting. It's about whether the method of protest was legal or not.
Yes, and as someone who's done jury service myself, I can remember that I only had one case, and I can remember the judge saying to us, you have to judge this on the facts or the evidence. It was a long time ago. I can't remember the exact wording. But that is so important. So just separating just for a second from specifically what went on here. But when the law says you cannot unduly influence a jury, we as journalists need to be very careful how we report things. The Russell Brand case at the moment being a case in point, so that we don't prejudice whatever may happen later down the line. And it is important to uphold the rule of law that we as a society do that. Moving to this case, I agree with Arion that it's complex, because the individual is quoting a very famous quote. So what have they done wrong? But by the same token, you could argue, well, hang on a minute here. They're subliminally giving a message to the jury nonetheless, hence why it's complex.
Well, they're just reminding them of their rights. Aren't they, Suchandrika? That's the idea of standing outside the courtroom with that placard. You're reminding them you have the right to make up your own decision ethically when you get in there. It's weird to say that's contempt of court, isn't it?
I suppose this is where you can have a bit of an interpretation job, right? And it's not in the interest of the prosecution service to let this go, because she's talking about what's going on in terms of the jury inside the court. Now, that in itself is not straightforwardly contempt of court. As far as I understand it from my media law, which is more about press reporting, you're much more trouble if you're talking about the discussions in the room when they go off to deliberate. But I think by manoeuvring it so that you kind of get like two good outcomes for the prosecution service, which is making sure no one's going to start doing what Trudy does, because 24 people have done it minimum already. And second,
copied the exact wording and then echoed the protest themselves.
Absolutely, yeah, doing what she's doing. And then secondly, the reporting of this case is not hinging on what's happening to juries, but it is sparking a fear, I think, in those of us who are reading all of it and trying to figure it out. What is happening with juries? How much are they not being given context? How much are they being told what to think? Is this, in a digital age, a way to try and kind of ring fence jurors and their knowledge when it is easy to Google, although that could also get them in trouble? Like, should we be worried or not? Is this related to the police crime sentencing bill and like what they're doing around protests and how scary that is? Or is it not? And I think it's so complex, and it's difficult to sort of get down to like what is actually happening here. And I actually fully try to understand like why they've decided to prosecute in her case, because she's not really done much. She's not even speaking to the jurors.
And to your point, Arion, about disentangling the motivation of the climate emergency from this particular legal action, even in this action, her motivation is that she's angry about climate change and wants to do something as a pensioner and make sure the next generation are more protected. And so you think there's a broader narrative about, okay, well, what do the authorities want? Like, if you're a climate change protester, you can't stand on the M25 and make a barricade. Fair enough. But you also can't stand outside with a placard quoting what's in the law. I mean, what do they want? Just another 30 years of writing ignored petitions?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that, taken on face value, this is a case where the judge has said this woman was engaging in jury tampering. And, all of us may feel sympathetic to the idea that jury tampering is a thing that we don't want to happen. But I think taken in its broader context, what we're seeing is this kind of feeling as though particularly climate protesters are being targeted for and singled out really for a kind of special treatment by the law. And if you look at kind of the recent really quite authoritarian crackdowns that have been instituted by the government to introduce these new laws, including the Public Order Act, which was introduced on May the 2nd this year, a lot of these laws really do look as though they are in reaction to these quite spectacular protests that have been done by climate groups like, at the National Gallery throwing a can of tomato soup over Van Gogh's sunflowers or gluing themselves to the M25 and these sorts of things that have caused a broad amount of both debate and consternation among some people who feel inconvenienced by them. But, the bringing in of these very serious and in some ways draconian laws looks like kind of overreach on the part of the government, and it feels particularly punitive in a way that I think has got people's heckles up. And so when you get a case like this that's so directly connected to a trial that is of environmental protesters, it feels like a part of this very particular thing that the government is doing, particularly to climate protesters.
But it's also the sort of radical cause underpinning it is we'd like the government to help people insulate their homes, Suchandrika. I mean, it's so seemingly inoffensive.
I know, it's really out there. I think what's interesting with this, like both Guy and Arion have kind of mentioned this, is that you've had really intense, spectacular, attention-grabbing, headline-grabbing displays from Just Stop Oil, from Insulate Britain. I remember once reading a tweet saying, who is the creative director of Just Stop Oil? Because they're doing a fantastic job. And it's true, they know how to cut through the media narrative and get on the front pages. And also, it does the job in getting this issue onto the front pages. But what Trudy is doing is inoffensive. She's not trying to speak to anyone, not doing the obvious things which look and feel like contempt of court. And other potential jurors can look at this case and it's one lone person being hauled into the highest court in the land to maybe get a big fine or 2 years. I think this is actually the thing that will make lots of people go, come on, this isn't fair, as opposed to some of the more like headline grabbing, groups of young people throwing orange powder onto things, onto the snooker, God forbid. I think almost this will cause a lot more sympathy. Like, I don't know, I think the optics are super, super looking bad for people trying to prosecute her. And I'm really hoping that it doesn't, she gets off.
Well, ironically, it would speak to her case, wouldn't it, Arion? That's the thing. If you're the jury then deciding her fate, you are probably making an ethical decision based on, do I want to lock up a 68-year-old for this?
Yes, there's no winning.
Yeah, entirely. And, I think that there's still some ambiguity in what that particular text means that she put up, because is it trying to exhort people to disregard everything that they've been told and all of the evidence that they've seen and just vote along the lines of what their gut reaction is? And like you, Guy, I've done jury service, and I felt a little bit appalled by the fact that some people I felt had just sort of come in there and they were like, he's a bad egg, lock him up, rather than trying to take things in a sort of sequential way and try to assess as best they could whether the person was guilty or innocent. Or alternatively, does it mean that you're just free to do what you are there to do as a juror without any impediment from the judge or indeed anyone else? And I think that those two possible interpretations do make this case a little bit more complicated than it might appear on face value.
And final point to you, Suchandrika, on this, bringing this story to this table with implications for the rest of us. What are the implications? Because there is a broader narrative about this government's crackdown on protest more generally, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, what is protest? If a 68-year-old woman standing silently holding words on a placard that are inside the court already, that are not bringing new information, that are not trying to give background on defendants or anything like that, then what is protest? And could it be absolutely anything? And also, there's a slightly broader point of, as much as the judge wants jurors to like just keep your mind on this case, there's a broader point of like the Met Police have managed to write to at least 12 of these 24 people who've repeated Trudy's style of kind of quite inoffensive protest. But if you get your phone stolen, I mean, you're getting nothing. If your house is burgled, like there is another narrative about the Met Police as well here. And you can't stop jurors going into the room going kind of like, well, the Met Police, what they've done for me recently. Like, this is such a complex case. It involves kind of all of society and this existential threat that affects all of society. And it's like we're trying to fight environmental crisis with the law. And I'm not sure it's the right way to go about it. And I think a lot of jurors are going to have that sympathy, even if they don't agree with gluing to yourself to bits of the motorway, which I don't think is amazing. It's not great. But at the bottom of it is a fight for our planet, or let's fight against the people doing the fight for our planet. Which one do you want? I mean, I don't know if the prosecution service can win this narrative. At the end of the day, they do send down the sentences. So I would like to see her not prosecuted or fined. And I'd like more clarity from the government on what a protest is. That would be helpful.
Okay. A reminder that it is your right to stop this podcast now if you want to. It's also your right to fast forward the ad break if you so wish. But Guy will be up next after this. Okay, Consumer Corner. Guy, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are supermarket loyalty cards a complete waste of time?
It used to be good. I don't think it's just as good as what it used to be. It's getting pretty bad. Sometimes I've seen myself returning things. Like if something's $7.50 somewhere and it's $6, I'll go just to get that one wee 50 a difference, because it adds up now.
They tell you there's a reduction, and then when you look, it's 10 pence. Sometimes it's a pence.
Some Scottish people talking to ITV News last Friday. Guy, what were they talking about?
The consumer group Which has done some very interesting research which found that loyalty schemes where you go into the store, use your club card, get money off, they're saying these deals aren't really the deals they're all cracked up to be. It's not just Tesco, by the way, Sainsbury's as well they looked into, but using club card as an example. They analysed 141 club card and nectar prices at Tesco and Sainsbury's and found in about a third of them the so-called regular price hadn't been the regular price for that long. So let's say, they were selling the chocolate at £2 if you had a club card. The regular price was £3. You're getting £1 off. It wasn't really £3 for that long, so it wasn't really a fair comparison. Basically, over-egging the discounts on the loyalty schemes.
Yeah, and there was an example in that ITV News report, actually. I saw the whole thing where the journalist went round the corner to Asda and got the same packet of Maltesers that was supposedly at the regular price of £3.50 in Tesco, but in Asda was the discounted club card price of £2.50 without any discount.
And you see this all the time if you can be bothered to check, because often you just go to your one supermarket and you don't know. But Which are very good at this, by the way, always do this sort of research, and so often find that the supermarkets have been inflating the so-called regular price to make the discounted price, whether it's through a club card or a nectar or some other means, to make the discounted price look better. But I think there's three things at play here. Number one, this is shining a light on food inflation, which is very high. It's come down a little bit in the last month, but it's very high at about 13% at the moment. Number two, are supermarkets jimmying their pricing to make their discounts seem better than they really are? Quite possibly, not always. I'm sure there will be times when they're legitimate. Number three, I think which we're also sort of pointing out that loyalty cards are a bit of a waste of time, which is how I introduced the whole thing. I actually think loyalty cards are a very good money saving technique because however they've jimmied the price, if they have, you still get the discount when you go there. And it's not like, you know, ironically, you're not really shopping around when you're shopping at a supermarket. You tend to go to the one that's near you. So you're not going to be going to lots of different ones to find the best price. So you just want to get the best price in the place you're at that time. And loyalty cards are actually a good way to do that these days. And you earn points, which can get you money off or vouchers off a whole range of other things in the future.
Yeah, the representative from Tesco who spoke to the newspapers, Arion, when this story came out, made that exact point. They were saying, well, almost regardless of this research, if you were using your club card, as Which's own research says, our shopping basket for items would still come out cheaper. So what's the problem? What is the problem with making people use a loyalty card?
Well, there is no problem. Technically, you can price things however you want, and you can give people different prices based on whatever ideology you want on any given day. But the fact is that supermarkets, loyalty cards used to be primarily about points, that you'd go there, you get your purchases for that week, and you'd accrue these points that could be spent in various ways, on either back in store or on things outside of that store. But now there really has been this switch. And the primary advantage of having a loyalty card is that it gives you access to lower prices. So the question of whether it's a good idea to have the loyalty card or not seems fairly transparent. Do you want to pay less or do you want to pay more? If you want to pay more, then don't have a loyalty card. So it's fairly straightforward in that way. The morality of it is slightly different, and particularly when you look at some of Which's individual examples that they highlight. For example, they had this one about a jar of Nescafe Gold Blend instant coffee, which sold at Sainsbury's for £6 with a Nectar card or £8.10 without. But Which found that the regular price had gone up from £6 to £8.10 2 days before the offer was launched. So basically, they'd come up with this new inflated price for everyone else just before they offered the inverted commas discount to their loyalty card holders. So I think what they're doing is punishing people for trying to shop elsewhere or wanting to shop elsewhere. So the better idea is to go with the loyalty card if you shop at one of these stores.
It's data, isn't it, Guy? It's not just how much cheese you eat in a day, but it's how much cheese does a Racing Post reader eat versus how much cheese does an avid consumer of AA batteries eat. I mean, that's the sort of information that is really useful to retailers. Maybe it isn't a problem to share that information. It feels weird not to have a choice, though.
Yeah, Tesco knows how much of a chocoholic I am. I live above a Tesco and quite often go there about 10 o'clock at night to buy some chocolate with my club card, so I get the cheaper price. Anyway, I don't have a problem with the data side of this, and this has come up loads over the years. These loyalty cards are nothing new. Here's why I don't have a problem. You know what you're getting into most of the time, but actually it can be beneficial because I get coupons and vouchers from Tesco and Sainsbury's, and they're actually things that are quite useful to me because they know I buy that thing.
Do they just ring a little bell for you now?
Brilliant. I always bring up my wife on these things, as you know. I say to my wife, shall I go to Tesco? And she knows that means chocolate, by the way. I think you end up getting quite useful discounts off the back of the data they have on you. Of course, the fact they have your email address means they can, I'm not just saying this is necessarily happening, but they can message you about their credit card and their loans and everything else that the supermarkets do these days. But that's kind of, I'll be honest with you, that is the way of the world. And it's not the most intrusive thing in the world. There's much bigger problems we have out there than just getting the odd email from Tesco or Sainsbury's or Asda or whoever it is, with an offer here or there.
Yeah, I think even if you do think that the sort of data collection side of it isn't the worst thing, I think the two-tier pricing component is a little bit problematic, at least if you ask the Competitions and Markets Authority, which itself has said that it's going to explore whether this is actually leading to a healthy kind of competition between supermarkets or whether it's actually just punishing consumers. And I think that, even the fact that this is under investigation indicates that it is potentially concerning, and particularly at a time when everyone's shopping baskets have got more expensive. One of the things that our colleague Holden pointed out was that the simple fact of having food at a lower price may actually be making inflation figures look slightly worse than they actually are, because the data is being based on the headline figures.
On the so-called real price that no one's really paying. Yeah.
Exactly. But a lot of people are paying a discount price. So, in fact, it even distorts our vision of what inflation in the country may be, which is problematic on a sort of, governmental, legislative level of how you deal with these things. But I think certainly at an individual level, where people are worried about getting the best price, the fact that you're being pushed in this way to adopt these schemes so as to get those best prices at least feels intuitively a little bit problematic.
What about demographic exclusion as well, Guy? I mean, a lot of these supermarkets are now really gearing their loyalty schemes towards having it all on an app. I know that you can theoretically still have the plastic card, but, that does make it harder for many elderly people, for disabled people. You have to be over 18 to sign into a lot of these loyalty schemes. So if you're 16 and you've got a job, you don't get the discount.
Yeah, and you're right about paying on apps. I mean, not just supermarkets, right across every industry going. Cash is becoming, to some extent, a thing of the past in some cases, or diminishing in others. And it is, going back to Holden. Going back to Arion's point about two-tier pricing, we see it actually. It's not just supermarkets, by the way. You see it right across the board. If you ever search for things like flights and hotels on comparison sites, quite often the hotel was £300, now it's £100 or whatever. Was it ever really £300? How are we to know? And other authorities, have called this out as well across multiple different industries, because it's two-tier pricing in the sense that in this case they're making you sign up to a loyalty scheme, which, remember, I don't think loyalty schemes are that bad, but they're still making you sign up to a loyalty scheme to get it. But also you've got a different type of two-tier pricing where they take the hotel example, that just happens to be the price. It's £100 for a night, and I'm saving £200 because it used to be £300. Was it ever really £300? It's not two-tier, but it's potentially overinflating a discount which wasn't really a discount in the first place.
And we were talking about the prices in pubs on last week's show, Suchandrika, as well, and how they're altering dynamic pricing at bars now based on what time of the day you go in. And I suppose it's a similar kind of conversation in a way. It just feels a bit tiresome for the customer. Like, why is it my responsibility to be monitoring which store charges what and when? It's not my job. Do you know what I mean? It used to be that you could go to a place and know that the price was the price. That was one of the advantages of living in a relatively stable economy.
I mean, those are the days of relatively stable economy and country, but they're gone now. But what I'll say is that, the Advertising Standards Agency would, and I would say does still have our back in terms of you can't have a Sainsbury's advert that attacks Tesco or whatever it is. But what it found is these pricing wars allow these supermarkets to bring other supermarkets' names into it. So an example is, I have Ocado, don't know how to say the name.
Definitely Ocado, I reckon. It's the last letters of avocado, so it's got to be, hasn't it?
Is that what it is?
Oh, dear.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, you learn something new every day.
It's named after avocado.
So obvious.
Even billed as our millennial correspondent, and she didn't know
that. I didn't know that, no. I have it on toast every week, and I have no houses. So so they now every week send me a little thing, say we checked your basket against Tesco's. If Tesco's was cheaper, they'll give me a voucher to cover the difference. The difference has never been over £3. But it is nice. But it's interesting that they get to talk to me about Tesco. But it allows these supermarkets to start talking about each other, which in a world where it's just like you see an advert on TV or on a billboard, they weren't allowed to do that. But now they can literally say, we've been doing our research and we know X, Y, Z. And I think that is a little creepy power they've now taken upon each other and upon themselves, and no one is telling them, no, you can't do that.
Okay, the podcast has obviously just descended to the point at which we all talk about our different shopping experiences. So, Arion, what's the best supermarket deal you've had recently?
Oof. Oh, actually, so I look, I'll say up front, I don't know anything about wine, but the other day I got a Chilean Malbec that was a Gran Reserva. And again, I only know that is an indication of quality that seemed discordant with the fact that it was £8. And I was like, yes, please.
Okay.
So that was a lovely Sainsbury's deal that I took advantage of and felt like I'd got a deal. Who knows? Guy,
best supermarket deal?
Unsurprisingly, it's around chocolate. Tesco used to do 3 bars of chocolate for £1.20, and they were like 70 or 80p for a bar. So it was actually cheaper to buy 3 than it was to buy 2. Obviously, as a chocoholic, I'd buy 3. That's gone now, unfortunately, sadly.
Have you tried the pretzel chocolate in Lidl?
I haven't.
Oh my God. I feel bad recommending it to you because it's like a sample piece of crack. I mean, don't go and buy it because you will never shop anywhere else ever again. Suchandrika.
I think I'm giving a shout out for avocado. I don't know how to say it. Avocado. I'm gonna have to think avocado now. They've got loads of deals. I'm not telling people to necessarily buy from them or not. But they do like a 3 kind of lunch type items for £8. If you're somebody who works from home a lot, you can be making your lunch from home and it's not costing you more than £8 a week, which is pretty good.
I'm going to call you Suchandrika Meal Deal Chakrabarti next time you're on the show. You wait.
That is my life.
It's going to come in.
My life.
Thank you to Suchandrika and Guy and Arion. Great value always. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Can't say better than that on a club card, can you? By searching for The Week Unwrapped. Wherever you get your podcasts, just tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.